Hi and welcome to the second IGCSE Computer Science Crash Course video, and in this second video I'll be going over the topic of programming. Now in programming we first need to talk about techniques used in programming, and the first programming technique I'd like to discuss are variables. Right, so variables are places where data is stored in the program or in the computer. The way you write a variable is pretty simple. In this case, I have a variable called speed, and the variable speed is equal to a value or a number called 50. Now, if I just break this down, the speed is the variable name, and you also call this the identifier. Then you have the assignment operator, that is just the equal sign when you consider Python, and then you have the value, which is 50. So basically the value 50 is now assigned to a variable called speed. Right, so let me just get to the Python editor for a few minutes. So like shown on screen, you can do speed equals 50, and so what this does is it saves the value 50 into the variable speed. So later in the program we can say we can call the value speed and it would refer to the value 50. So I would do that by saying print speed. What this does is it prints the value stored in speed. So if you look down below, if I run this program, you can see the value 50 is now printed. Right, so there is a small set of rules you need to follow when you name your variables. The first rule you need to follow is that your variable name should be short and meaningful. Secondly, your variable names cannot have any spaces. So for example, in this case, if you have a variable name as two different words, speed space variable equals 10, that wouldn't work because the program does not know which one you should store the variable to. The next naming convention is that your variable name cannot start with numbers or symbols. Next, your names cannot use any reserved keywords. So in Python, there are a few keywords that are reserved for built-in functions like print, input, integer, int. There are things that cannot be used in your variable names. Now just to show this to you, if I say print equals 10, you wouldn't get any error. But imagine if you had to see what print is storing, and you do print. So you're calling the function and the variable both print. So now the computer is going to have a difficulty checking whether which one is the function, which one is the variable. So you're going to get a type error. That's pretty much it for naming conventions. Now moving on to another section of variables. Since variable names are not always simple, you might have to write variable names consisting of multiple words. So there are three main ways that we can do this. The first way is to use camel case. Camel case is where your variable names, multiple words are connected as one word, but each word's first letter is written as a capital letter. So these capital letters look like humps of a camel, so that's why we call this camel case. The next tool that helps us is snake case. In snake case, instead of capital letters of each word, we replace the spaces between each word with an underscore. So once again, this looks like a snake, that's why we call this snake case. The next thing I'd like to talk about are comments. Now if you look at this example, you have a bit of code, print hello, print 8 plus 2, and so on. And I've written the line numbers of each line on the left side. So as you can see, this is just a normal program that executes instructions. Say that you as the programmer comes back to the code at a later time and you want to figure out what this code does. So comments are a way of describing your code. So in front of your code, you can add a line that starts with a hashtag that describes what this line or what this piece of code does. So in this case, line number 1, this line prints hello. Line number 2, this line prints 10. So if I just show this to you in Python, in front of each of these statements, I can say what it does. So I can say this line prints hello, and next line you can say this line prints 10. Right? So if I just run this, you will see that hello and 10 are printed. Since you've written it with a hashtag, that part of the program doesn't get affected to the overall code. Right, so moving on to constructs. So we have three main constructs: selection, repetition, and sequence. Sequence is just what we are doing right now, where we execute instructions one after the other. Selection is where you make an if condition. If something is true, you do something. If something is false, you do something else. So the way you do if in Python is easy. You first start with the keyword if. After the if, you say what the comparison you want to do is. So after the comparison, you need to put a colon, and if that comparison is true, you need to do something. You say that after the if condition, and you need to leave a little space from the left side of the window. So you call this indentation. If you want to have another if condition, you can do elif. So if the first if condition is false, the program checks for the next if statement, that is elif. In elif, you can put once again a comparison. If something else is true, you put a colon, do something. And finally, if all of these statements are false, you can do something else. That's why you say else colon, and within after the else you do something. So just heading on to Python, I can write an if condition like this. So I start by declaring two variables, a equals 10 and b equals 8. Then I'll say if a is greater than b, put a colon, print a is bigger. Then I can have an elif statement that says if b is greater than a, print b is bigger. And then finally I can have an else statement that is print a is equal to b. Now if I run this, since a is greater than b, it says a is bigger. So that's pretty much it for selection and if conditions. The next thing I like to talk about is repetition. Now say you want to execute a certain part of your code again and again. The way that you get away from this is by writing a repetition, or in simple terms we call this a loop. There are two types of loop. The first loop is a while loop. Now in a while loop, you have to start by giving a counter variable that is set to 0 or any other starting value, right? After the counter variable is declared, we need to say while counter variable is less than some value. So that value is the number of times you want to repeat that block of code. So while counter variable is less than 10, you execute the statements under the while loop. So I can do something within the while loop. And then another important thing to remember is at the end of doing all of your steps, you need to say counter variable plus equals 1, or you can say counter variable equals counter variable plus 1. Here what you do is you just increment the value 0 to 1 and then 1 to 2 and so on until you go on until 10. Because if you don't do this, the while loop will get stuck in an infinite loop because the value will always be 0. Let me just get on to Python to explain this to you. I can say counter equals 0 and then while counter is less than 10, I print hello 10 times. And another thing you need to remember is to increment the count. So I can do this by saying counter plus equals 1. You can also say counter equals counter plus 1. Same thing, it's not going to be a problem. So as you can see below, hello is printed 10 times. The next type of repetition I'd like to talk about are for loops. Now for loops achieve the same thing as while loops, but they have a slightly different way of writing it. Now in a for loop, you need to start by saying the keyword for. Then you need to say the variable name of the counter. So I'll call this counter. For counter in range 10. That is within the for loop here, you run the code 10 times. I'll show this to you in Python. I can do for counter in range 10. I can print hello. This would achieve the exact same thing as we did in the while loop, but you avoided 2 lines of code where you had to declare the variable and increment the variable. That is already done in the for loop. If I run this, you get hello printed 10 times. Now that's pretty much it for programming constructs and the techniques of programming. In the next video, I'll cover the remaining sections of programming such as functions and so on. So that's pretty much it, and thank you.